The Sunday of the weekend after my father was discharged from the hospital happened to be Mother's Day. I was still in Spokane. My brother had flown back to Maryland the day before. I missed Christine and the boys, but whatever had been vital and urgent in my daily life in Albuquerque felt suspended, as if my father had died, as if he had committed rather than attempted suicide. I felt shattered, but I couldn't put into words why. Late at night on the phone, I talked and talked to Christine, and she listened. Christine is a talented listener. Unlike me, she doesn't interrupt with highly workable solutions, with suggestions and advice, with interpretations of significance. She just let me tell her that this happened, and then this happened. I didn't have to make sense of anything. Christine said, "I'm so sorry, and I wish I could be there with you, and you must be so sad." For the past 7 years, my life had been dominated by fatherhood. I was not used to thinking of myself as a son. I was not used to thinking of myself as deceived. I was not used to thinking much about my father at all. When I thought of my parents, when I worried about my parents, I worried about my mother's ovarian cancer and her chemotherapy, or I worried about whether or not my father was making sure that my mother was taking her bipolar medication. I needed my father to keep his eye on things. It never once occurred to me that my mother might need to keep a closer eye on him. I stayed in Spokane for nearly 2 weeks. I didn't feel ready to leave my mother on her own. Another way to say this is that I needed her to not be alone because I couldn't bear the sadness she had to bear. My mother and father loved each other. Their love was unferocious, grudgeless, without jealousy or tyranny, delirium or disdain. It was playful, gentle, a love hard to find in books. It was rooted in an abiding friendship and a mutual lifelong desire for each other's company. They often abandoned me to friends and neighbors and went, of all places, to garage sales and auctions. Their zeal for garage sales and auctions was matched by many things, like bowling, like playing cribbage or two-handed pinochle late into the evening. They went for walks. They read books side by side for hours upon hours. When I was a child, we would gather in the living room and my father would play folk songs on the guitar and we would all sing. Michael, row your boat ashore, blowing in the wind, 500 miles, hard times come again no more. My father's voice was, and still is, deep and booming and soulful. My mother cannot carry a tune. She has, and she will freely admit this, a terrible singing voice. All through my childhood, my mother's voice threatened to pull each of us away from the melody. This was not an open secret. The quality of her singing voice was often acknowledged. My mother sang anyway, gleefully. And I'm guessing now that my father loved her even more for this. Of course he did. Sometimes at the end of a song, my mother said, "God hears my true voice." And my father would say, "Yes, he does," or "He must," or "I hear it too." These days, the implicit code is that parents put their love of their children first, before their love for one another. And only controversial parents are willing to declare that they put their love for their spouses first. When I was growing up, I unconsciously understood that my parents' love for each other was always first, and then came their love for their children. I did not question this. I had no reason to question it. Nothing seemed wrong. 9 days after my father attempted suicide, my mother and I went bowling. She did not want to stay at home, perfecting her dignity and resilience. She was 67. Her hair was more gray and white than black, and more thin since it had grown back after the 8 rounds of chemotherapy 4 years earlier. She had a red scar down the middle of her nose from the surgery to remove skin cancer a few years before that. Both cancers were in remission. She worked full-time as a university dean. She walked 3 miles a day. She ate steel-cut oatmeal with fresh fruit for breakfast. She ate a sweet potato with cinnamon for lunch. She drank her English breakfast tea with a splash of sweetened condensed milk. She'd grown up in a small town in northern Nevada, and as a young woman was accomplished with a rifle, and one winter even ran a trap line and sold beaver and mink and fox pelts. but now she did yoga once a week. She bowled on teams in 2 different leagues. Summer league would be starting in a few weeks, and she needed to practice. When I was a boy growing up in Nebraska, my mother and I bowled together in the Cornstalk and Kernel League. We cleaned up. We took first place several years running. This may be myth-making, but in my memory, one year we each had high average and high score in our respective parent-child categories. In May of each year, my mother and her sister, my Aunt Di, traveled to a different mid-sized city, Topeka, Oklahoma City, Reno, bowling in the Senior U.S. Nationals. Every October, they bowl in the World Senior Games in St. George in southern Utah. My mother doesn't rattle. She has uncanny consistency. Her address and approach are always the same. 3 steps, a slight hop, her backswing in a single plane, her knee bent low at release, her follow-through as if she were about to shake your hand. She throws the same first ball every time. One year at Nationals, she and her doubles partner took 2nd place out of 7,322 other doubles teams. I'm going to interrupt myself and say I emailed my mom and I wanted to know what that was, and I said, what place did you come in? And she sent that back, and that was the number, 7,322. But on this particular day, my mother was off her mark. She threw bedpost splits and baby splits. She kept hitting the Brooklyn side of the head pin. Her ball drifted toward the gutter as if drawn by a magnet. If she knocked down 8 pins, one of the remaining pins was hidden, a sleeper. She threw open frame after open frame, no strikes, no spares. All this despite having her own monogrammed ball, her own shoes, her own wrist brace and powder and towel. I was wearing worn-out red and green rental shoes. The thumb hole of my rental ball was too loose, but I struck the pocket flush. I threw strike after strike. It was my day. I had great action, the pins flying and mixing. The first 2 games weren't even competitive. My mother bowled more than 30 pins below her average. I didn't have an average. I hadn't bowled in a few years. But if I bowled like this all the time, I could quit my job as a teacher and join the tour. I could be on ESPN too. My mother said, "Does Christine have any idea about the secret life you've been leading at Holiday Bowl?" I shook my head but didn't laugh. I didn't turn to look at her. I was looking down the shiny lane at the pins, set up in their orderly configuration. I had always appreciated my mother's black humor, but I wasn't ready to hear it just then. I didn't want to think about my father. I didn't want to think at all. This is something I can do, something I've always been able to do. Put things away, events, feelings, put them far from my mind and my heart. I wanted to throw a strike, and I did. I walked back to take my seat. I said, "Christine has no idea." The 3rd game was closer. I'd been trying to throw strikes, but with my 2nd ball, I sandbagged a few of the spares. I wanted to at least make it close, but at the same time, I didn't want my mother to know. She wouldn't like that. My mother was the only person I knew who hated losing more than I did, and anything. It didn't matter what, pinochle, horseshoes, you name it. But she wanted to win fair and square. She was fierce about fairness. On my last ball for a spare in the 10th frame, I guttered a makeable leave, and I lost by 3 pins. My mother said, "You did that on purpose." I thought I would lie, but found that I couldn't. I did, yes. "I wouldn't have done that," my mother said fiercely. Seriousness was all over her face. "I would have beat you. I know."